Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of our ongoing editorial webinar series, Coffee Talk. Each hour-long, information-packed episode organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine features the observations and insights of an independent expert on a wide range of tech industry topics. Today, I wanted to offer many thanks to our underwriting sponsor of this episode. He tried to say, Red Canary, a pioneer of managed detection and response for secure endpoints, cloud, and whatever comes next. Without their support, this series would not be possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator. Today's topic is Intro to Endpoint Security, and our main presenter is cybersecurity expert Ian Thornton-Trump. But before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. This episode is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way in the next few days. We'll make some time during the talk for questions. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Our sponsor has provided some extra resources you won't want to miss. They're available now on your console. And as a small thank you to the first 200 attendees who stick with us to the end, we will be sending you a $5 gift certificate to Starbucks. It's a cup of joe to go with the info. Now let's meet our first speaker. Ian Thornton-Trump is the Chief Information Security Officer at Cyjax and the CTO of Octopi Managed Services. A 5-year career includes service in the intelligence branch of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Forces Military Police Reserves, and the RCMP. Yep, that's the Mounties. He's been a cybersecurity consultant for both multinational and regional organizations, and today, as a virtual CISO, he helps both large and small companies build security operations and cyber threat intelligence programs. He's one of our favorite presenters. You're in for a great session. Take it away, Ian.
All right, thank you so much, John. And yeah, we're gonna do something a little bit more fun. We're gonna take it in a different direction. But I wanted to sort of build a pirate theme, and mostly because sometimes the lovely people at Redmond Channel Partners in their Coffee Talk series and the sponsors like, okay, so Red Canary, got to say a shout out to them. And as John said, it's great if you would follow them on social media, on their LinkedIn page, and also on Twitter, because they put out a lot of really interesting stuff. So you might be wondering why I'm all like hackered up on one side, and I've put the pirate trial of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, because I want to talk about, in the historical context, about pirates and cyber security, specifically threat actors, which are attacking your endpoint. Back in the day, they would be attacking your ship or your city. But we're going to talk about this from that perspective. And we're going to kind of entitle this one, The High Seas of Endpoint Protection. Because, like, make no mistake, it's really the endpoints that are giving up the ghost. They're the ones that are giving up the access and the data. Now, we know this because the various studies and reports come out and suggest that phishing email is still our number one threat out there, okay? Now, there's a lot of people that would argue that it's like exposed vulnerabilities and things like that. Not disputing that fact at all. But it's the exposed vulnerabilities one that is also really part of the endpoint protection problem that we have in general. Now, I think, one of the buzzwords that we see quite a bit is zero trust, okay? And I've done lots of Redmond Channel Partners and Coffee Talks and their wider series of webinars that go a little bit longer and stronger on the topic of zero trust. But it's my fundamental belief that these first two nuts, if you will, of zero trust are the ones that are tough to crack, okay? So I think when we look at the whole picture of where we're at right now is that protection of endpoints, visibility, automation, and orchestration capabilities like you would find with managed detection and response, either outsourced to a great group like Red Canary or insourced to your own team, is protecting identities that are in use in your organization. because the phishing email attacks that we've seen now are mostly about trying to grab credentials. Yes, in some cases, they will try and land a payload on an endpoint. The user will inadvertently click on a link or have an attachment that will function to pull down the possibility of an exploit, followed by a Trojan, followed by a payload. All of that stuff is happening on the endpoint, especially the endpoints that are in the hands of your users who may or may not be within the perimeter of your network. So, like, if you want to really kind of start the zero trust journey towards visibility, I feel like these are the two key points that begin that journey. And interestingly enough, organizations' hygiene, when they do audits, when they are, when they actually, either get breached, these are a lot of the times they're the patient zero. Now, even though we see a lot of media coverage, folks, on exposed vulnerabilities like QoP and the MoveIt SQL injections, I'm going to demystify this a little bit, because those are the ones that grab headlines. Those are the ones that the cyber criminals are using to really proclaim that the company is breached. And of course, they're doing it for the ransomware and stuff like that. So when we look at zero trust, I don't want anyone to get afraid or do the eye rolls. I see you there in the audience doing that, because honestly, if you translate zero trust, it really equals dealing with our legacy tech stack, okay? And dealing with the things that we did back in the 1990s or the 2000s that we now have to undo. And that can be a very difficult mission for a lot of organizations to embark upon. And this is where, one of the solutions is to get a trusted partner to do the managed detection and response within your environment across the infrastructure, the network, the endpoints, and even identity in terms of a list of compromised identities within a data breach. You want to win hearts and minds for Christmas, go with the new recommendations from NIST or the NCSC here that suggest that 1 year password resets or never until there's evidence that suggests that those credentials have been compromised. Users get sloppy, they get lazy, and they don't like changing their passwords in an organization. And it does, depending on the level of maturity and single sign-on, it does create a massive inconvenience to get those properly synchronized for the business. So these be the truths are, okay, that's in pirate speak, but we're talking about that loss of information through credential, and that organizations are failing through credential grabbing. Organizations are failing to protect this personal data of customers and employees, mostly because of the customers being compromised by valid employee credentials that then get into the system, but not always. We're also talking about web applications that are poorly protected by the organization that are potentially vulnerable to SQL injection. So there's a lot of different things under the hood here. But what we really need to understand here is that organizations are compromised by exposure and interaction with malicious internet content. That's it. The broadside, there you go, is coming at us from the cyber pirates that are out there trying to breach your home, okay, where all your treasure is. Great metaphor. And this is why I got so excited when they gave me a little creative license to talk about this. But really, when we think about where we're at, endpoint technology can only do so much against these cyber pirates, because once they're actually inside the network, it's a whole different ballgame to try and identify what they're doing and knock them out before they get it. So think about those stealthy movies where people are climbing up the anchor chains to get on board your ship, only to turn around and steal your treasure or possibly sink your ship. So there's some great metaphors in this. Now, we also have a big problem with the definition of endpoint. Now, according to Microsoft, they talk about servers and virtual stuff. When you look at the wider picture, there's a heck of a lot of stuff in your organization that is attached to your network, but so we can define that as an endpoint, as in that's where the network ends, right? But at the same time, if you're if you're not 100% certain about what your network looks like, you actually have a bigger problem, right? We can't protect what we can't see, right? So I think when I look at the whole thing, and a comprehensive view is really about having policies and procedures for everything that's connecting into your network. Now, there are some fantastic hacker cases of lateral movement from building management systems into the main network. There's a famous hacking that occurred when a fish tank in Las Vegas casino was compromised, and that was used to conduct a follow-on cyber attack against the organization, which ended up pulling a premier database of all the high rollers that casino had on file. So this is where that piece of, okay, we can even be and suggest that we're good when it comes to our perimeter defenses. Everybody's sort of listening to what people are saying out there. It's attack surface management, it's attack surface management. But the lateral movement inside an organization can be the signal within the noise. And it's really important to call that out there, because unless you're a robust organization that has an IR team, that has a 24/7 security operations center that's properly integrated with your network management, there are silos. And those silos are where the evil things dwell, right? Those are where the bad guys will find out that there's a disconnect between human resources and scale account removal. So if an account for your organization is subject to a data breach of some sort, it's quite possible that account might be live, or that account might have not had its password reset, or it may not have been decommissioned. And we see some incredible examples of this. Colonial Pipeline, the patient zero in that was a really interesting thing. It was partially a forgotten about endpoint VPN concentrator that had employee's credentials. The VPN endpoint concentrator was unpatched, and it was one of those terrible vulnerabilities that we've seen, which would ante up the credentials for that particular endpoint, like all the users and their passwords. It's a terrible exposure of a vulnerability. Turns out that account had not been disabled in Active Directory, so that's why the entire billing system for Colonial Pipeline through lateral movement from this VPN endpoint was compromised by the ransomware operators. So the takeaway here is policies and procedures for everything that attaches to the network, which of course raises the ugly question about, how are we going to deal with the operator or the cyber protagonist that has made it inside? What are some of the techniques we're going to use? Well, we can go to arguably the most important historical figure in the history of privateers, right? Loosely linked to pirates. Pirates were basically out for their own game, but privateers were basically in service to a sovereign and acting on behalf of that country. So in this particular case, we have the English defender, Sir Francis Drake, against the evil Spaniards at the time. Now, there are wonderful allies in NATO and other things, but at the time, it was the Spaniards, and he was sailing under a sovereign. So in a way, he could be considered the first advanced persistent threat on the high seas of England, sponsored by the English government with the intense purposes of attacking the Spanish. So here was the interesting observation that I had when I looked at that. And in the background of that is the Isthmus of Panama, which Sir Francis Drake's approach on the city and attack, Nombre de Dios, okay, was a spoiling attack for what his true objective was, okay? So think of his attack, the Spanish were afraid of losing cities, and rightly so, okay? But the problem was they got situated and they forgot that Sir Francis Drake had interdicted the mule train of silver, which he brought back to Queen Elizabeth I. So again, our obsession with protecting our towns and villages, i.e. the servers, is often misplaced. Because unless that server is, of course, exposed like a remote desktop or Citrix, etc., right, we are in a really interesting world of hurt where we're pretending that if we secure our servers, we're fine. No, we have to find out where the crown jewels are. And if the crown jewels are at a mule train heading to the Spanish fleet, we better be aware of that and guarding them. And the question, of course, I have to ask is EDR, is endpoint detection and response enough? The answer is no, because in a lot of cases, EDR will fail to pick up things and like a set of valid credentials that is used to get into the organization, and the cyber attackers are going slow and low. They perhaps are doing something to distract the security team, like a giant denial of service attack, right? And sure enough, they can get away with their evil plans to steal your crown jewels because you're concentrated on the wrong thing and through misdirection. Okay, so I told you about how, you know, this famous attack worked, which is so similar to a lot of parallels. I'm going to talk about the defense. And here's another dude from history, oddly enough, named Francis as well. This is Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabethan, known as the spy master during the Elizabethan era. He had friends. He had everyone reporting into him about the movements and everything like that. And again, we have the intelligence component of the APT group that was designed to go after the Spanish. And here's the interesting thing. He was the one that got reports of the Spanish Armada being assembled to attack England. What he was able to do was feed that information back to Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I, who then mustered the British Navy, and the culmination was the Battle of Trafalgar, which, of course, Lord Admiral Nelson himself made an appearance and vanquished the Spanish. So this is an example of when you got the intel on what may be attacking your organization and how they might attack and what that enemy's capability is. Well, my friends, I don't need to spell it out for you, right? It's critical when you have those IOCs, when you have an organization or group that's capable of hunting for those early stages of the threat. And you can mitigate it by getting the right information into the right hands at the right time. Wow. I just love talking about that. It also could be that when I did my university schooling, my passion was history, and one of my final dissertations was on the pirate and the pirate culture, right? Now, we all have myths and legends that we attach to cybersecurity, right? Like no update Friday. It's a terrible time to patch firmware in the old data center on a Friday because you'll be working a long week. But I think what we understand is there are so many exceptions that fall outside of what we would traditionally like to see when it comes to like a whole picture of our network, right? We have the legacy systems, right? Sometimes organizations have stood up, or even vendors have stood up, systems within your organization that you have very little visibility on. Some may even have just local accounts to manage and are not integrated into AD. So the user IDs may be, but the actual health of the box may not be. And there are some legacy systems, especially if they're appliances, you can't really even install an endpoint agent on, right? The other problem that we have is that we need early warning when it comes to signs that we have a bad patch happening within our environment. And I think in a lot of cases, that is something that organizations that have big reach and that are in tune with what's going on, and monitoring odd things like Twitter and Reddit and Slashdot and other forums that are out there to detect that those bad patches are being problematic. And a bad patch on a few dozen endpoints or whatnot is, an inconvenience to individual users. A bad patch on something like an Exchange server or an on-premise SharePoint server can affect hundreds of users. So we have to keep in mind and take a risk-based approach to that and really vet a lot of the things that we're doing. And then, of course, there's the best practices that we require. And, sometimes it has to be built into the terms and conditions of that engagement, especially if it's coming into your environment. And, I hate to be confrontational in those particular situations, but if you are asking about, well, how do we back up this magic box with the blinky lights that you put into our environment? What's the disaster recovery capabilities of your company to replace said box? I mean, Barracuda ESG, one of the most devastating cyber attacks I've ever seen on a brand. CISA and Mandiant come out and said, oh, by the way, the patch, it does nothing. These goggles do nothing. The patch was ineffective in preventing firmware-level malware that was inserted by the threat actors. And so ultimately, Barracuda ESG devices were recalled by the manufacturer because they couldn't repair them in the field. So this is something, that we as cybersecurity professionals have to think about in terms of, the CVEs coming out. What is the asset management class? Is it business critical? All of these things are super important to have knowledge of, because endpoint is not just about the workstations and the servers and the virtual clouds. It's about routers and switching, and especially in OT environments, folks. This is where the rubber hits the road. Just recently, there was a pretty nasty attack on an organization that had not been able to patch its OT environment despite a CISA warning to do so. So difficult situations out there. Now, what I wanted to do here too is talk about this particular threat actor, some great threat intel from Recorded Future. And you can see quite clearly from this, you've got a whole bunch of exposed servers and appliances as a mixed bag. Now, one of the reasons we see a lot of attacks on endpoint devices, and these are all, I would classify them as endpoint devices. Not only is there a clear call to action on the vulnerability management side from the CVEs that are being exploited, that are in the hands of the enemy, but we can see a massive attack going on for Microsoft Exchange Server. Now, the scary thing about that is that all happened in the wake of the SolarWinds data breach and then the compromise of Microsoft, which led to the viewing of and downloading of Microsoft Exchange source components. And it was really unfortunate because what we're dealing with the Microsoft Exchange platform and support for POP and support for SNTP and support for other protocols. We are essentially, these systems can be in some cases using code built in the 80s and the 90s, which are just not able to withstand the type of cyber attacks that can be unleashed now with the capabilities that we have in the hands of the bad guys now. So what I'm saying is that not only is it imperative that you keep these endpoints up to date with the latest patches as advised, especially if they have internet exposure, and you must do them fast. I think one of the audit reports that I read is now calling for a maximum of a 14-day patching cycle. Now that's bonkers because the amount of effort that it takes to just patch on a monthly basis is staggering. To now require that at a 14-day interval is a massive undertaking, at least doubling, if not tripling, your resources that need to be applied there. And of course, what you're dealing with too is a situation where the more stuff that goes longer that isn't patched and updated becomes the major vulnerabilities and security erosion, if you will, for your organization. And this is what we're seeing when we're asking legacy pieces of hardware, sometimes long abandoned by vendor support, being critical for businesses. I mean, this is exactly what's getting hit. And in a lot of cases, it may be a direct attack on that, especially if there's remote code execution, or it may be a set of compromised credentials. But however you cut it, the endpoint problems that we have are here to stay for a while. And you need help, and you need expert advice, yeah. Now, I'm going to throw out there just kind of what I see when I go into an organization and I try to give an assessment along zero trust. I try to develop like a gap analysis, if you will, okay, of where we kind of need to get to. So everyone here has the ability, I think, to do this basic 1 through 6, okay? This is what I call the smooth sailing tips to get your gold, keep your gold, and make sure that you're delivering the gold to the people that it needs to be delivered to, okay? So we got to have full disk encryption on our endpoints, for sure. A hardened golden workstation and server OS images. When you look back and you look at the Microsoft exploits, especially the ones that were used in Stuxnet, and then you look at the Windows spooler service on an endpoint, there is absolutely no reason, unless of course you're printing, to have a endpoint in the cloud that has the spooler service by Microsoft running. That is just an attack service that you don't need, and one of the longest running set of vulnerabilities that you've seen across all of the endpoints. The other one the other day I was checking into it was the Microsoft server service, especially when it's still binding to outdated protocols, right? You wouldn't let a friend yet use NetBIOS, so why are you using NetBIOS, really? And of course, EDR, whether that's the upgraded and licensed one by Microsoft, which can be sucked into Sentinel or Chronicle or a third-party SIEM, I don't know, I literally just drew a blank on one of my favorite SIEM companies, but that's okay. But the point is that telemetry needs to be sucked up and put into some sort of platform for action. Now, this is the more difficult part, right? Vulnerability management program for hardware, operating systems, and applications. Many folks are pushing this out to a third party now because this is a big attack surface for the organization, and the IT capabilities, security team capabilities are limited within a lot of organizations, especially medium business, where we're making the IT security person also is the IT manager person. They have to balance all those responsibilities. End-of-life programs. Listen, any sort of assessment that comes in that shows red because there's a legacy device that's currently unsupported by the vendor, supports insecure protocols and stuff like that, it has to go. I know you want to suck another year of life out of it because it could be a pricey thing, but it's risk within your organization. One of the big things now is about EDR or MDR, looking at entity behavior analytics. Microsoft has included that kind of package. It can give you real insight into what may be sketchy or anomalous going on there. And again, we talk about RBAC and we talk about identity and access management, role-based access controls, and stuff like that. That becomes a critical part of your strategy moving forward, like levers, joiners, et cetera, et cetera. Now, one of the biggest wins in organizations is when the security department can work with IT and the business and decide that SSO is the only way that you can that you can authenticate the third-party applications. This makes the levers and joiners problem much easier, because otherwise, if you have the business managing a lot of their third-party SaaS, IT, well, the cows have just left the barn and you may not ever get them back. So that's really important. And of course, minimum security policy standards for managed and unmanaged devices that are accessing the network or remote access. Now, the other big thing that I think is super important is really to roll back and look at this from a practical perspective and understand that there's a lot of other stuff that you're going to need to do for security compliance, for your ISO certification, NIST certifications, and stuff like that. So again, you want that EDR, MDR for all endpoints. And if you can't put an agent on it, you need to have logs that you can build use cases around, right? Understand you're managing against real business risk, right? The CVE rating means nothing. If the system doesn't have any exposure and it doesn't actually reach out to the internet, or it can only be reached from internal, you can have systems that have very high CVE ratings, but there needs to be a plan in place to deal with it. It may not have to move as much as a sense of urgency, right? Microsegmentation for unpatchable legacy critical business systems, 100%, right? Monitor the DR status of critical business systems daily. Oddly enough, in a lot of security compliance things that I've seen, including cybersecurity essentials, DR is not really mentioned, or it's mentioned in passing. I think it's critical, and I love to see the disaster recovery status on critical business systems daily. It gives me assurance that we might have a chance of recovering. CMD and network maps are everything. I can't say that more. You do need some firm or some help, actively discovering things that are on the system. And again, folks, it's pretty simple. If it's a beige box, or as I like to say, the oldest system is usually the most vulnerable, advocate, work with the business on replacing it with something that is more up to date, or even better, is a SaaS application where vulnerability management and exposure is kind of someone else's problem. So that's it. Thanks for spending that 35 minutes with me. We now have some Q&A action, and that's it. That's the pirate deck.
Thanks, Ian. So we've got time for just a couple quick questions. Let's go with this one to start. How do I get good free threat intel on what to patch?
Yeah, I mean, the number one go-to, now I'm not going to say it's timely so much, but the number one free resource is CISA's Common Exposure Vulnerability, the KEV as I like to call it. It has all of the data that you need to know. The problem is many organizations struggle with their asset management, but once you know what you have, it's really easy to find out what the bad guys are using against you. And there's other threat feeds like Cisco Talos as well that you can look at that will help you out. But if you want stuff more timely, well, that's where the cybersecurity industry can give you various offerings using threat intel and honeypots and tell you about not what's already killing organizations, but what might be killing organizations in the near future.
Okay, we've only got time for one more question. So let's go with this one from Lynn, who's a favorite attendee. Hi, Lynn. Users play a critical role in endpoint security. How can organizations effectively educate and raise awareness among users to prevent common security pitfalls?
This is absolutely great because the UK has this super annoying saying called "see it, say it, sort it." Okay? Now, I love it because it's so kitschy and it is just a mind worm. But what it is if you see something dodgy on your endpoint or something crazy happening, right, say it to your security team and let the security team engage and tell you. If you're suspicious, report that to the security team. Most security teams will want to get the heads up that there's something a bit weird going on, because then they can launch an investigation before it's too late. And Lynn is 100% right. The other thing I can't stress enough is educate people about the threats that are coming at your business or your industry vertical. Even if it's like a company where you're pretty hardened, it's a small organization, maybe expand that to include common scams that are going out there. There's some great sources of threat intel just about business email compromise and various scams going on. But the more you make yourself useful for those users that are overwhelmed with the security, just become approachable and work to help them out, because they're under the gun to get the job done. So you can really help them out by making sure that they're working in the safest computing environment and that they have somebody to ask if something's dodgy.